Welcome students. In our massive open online course on research methodology in history, today we shall be speaking on subaltern history. Subaltern history is a new genre of history writing in modern India that emerged in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. The first series of this genre was edited by Ranajit Guha, who was of the opinion that the historiography of Indian nationalism is beset with the prejudiced elitism that described the development of Indian national movement and consciousness and the making of Indian nation as elite achievements. The historiographies so far have considered the growth of Indian nationalism from different perspectives, like the colonial or the British historiography in India looked upon Indian history as a response of the Indian bourgeois elite to the stimulus provided by British ideas, institutions, opportunities, and resources. The Indian nationalist historiography, on the other hand, pictured Indian nationalism as primarily an idealist venture in which the indigenous elite led the people from subjection to freedom. Ranajit Guha was of the opinion that neither of the above two views or neither of these two views could explain Indian nationalism properly, because neither of them have acknowledged the contribution of the common people on their own independently of the elite. Guha asserted that, parallel to elite politics, there was a domain of people's politics in which the principal actors were the subaltern classes and the groups that constituted the mass of the Indian population. Guha therefore realized that there is a need to develop an alternative discourse based on the recognition of the subaltern domain of politics, and thus there was emergence of subaltern history. Guha realized that there was a necessity to emphasize the role played by the common people, the so-called ordinary people, in the shaping of Indian history, and this particular aspect led him to the emergence of subaltern history. The series titled Subaltern History came up as a collection of monographs on diverse unconnected topics that highlighted the struggles, the activities, and the participation of the lower sections of the Indian masses hitherto neglected by the Indian historiography. The Subaltern Studies addressed a range of topics extending in time from the Mughal period to the 1970s, stretching from communalism, industrial labor, to peasant rebellion, factory workers' movement, and indigenous protest. A distinctive feature of subaltern historiography is its labor orientation and Marxian tone, premise, and analysis. The subaltern historiographical treatment asserted that the revolts were the methods and the means by which the lower class people tried to improve their condition and attracted the attention of the elites in colonial India. So thus we find that in subaltern history, there is more emphasis on revolts and rebellions and the methods used by the so-called ordinary section of the Indian population to assert their rights, to improve their conditions. Guha affirmed that the peasants, the Adivasis, the factory workers, the villagers, the hill and the plains people never stumbled or drifted into rebellion on their own, until they found that their pleadings of various kinds have failed or were not listened. So we find that Guha highlighted this particular aspect, that these rebellions were not something which were carried on by the people on their own. These rebellions were actually reactions to the policies of the higher authorities on the lower classes of the population. Insurgencies, if adapted by them, were deliberate and desperate ways to come out of the intolerable conditions of existence created by wicked landlords, extortionists, usurers, dishonest traders, venal police, irresponsible processes, and partisan processes of laws. So thus, as I have already mentioned, that according to Guha and other subaltern historians, if insurgency or rebellious methods were adapted by the lower section of the population, these were actually protests against the so-called exploitation and torture carried on them by landlords or traders, police, and other higher authorities. The subaltern historiography attached the subaltern consciousness with elements like communalism, religion, and superstition. The term subaltern is widely used in post-colonial studies related to various disciplines. So here I would like to mention that the term subaltern is not particular to history writing in India only. We find that the term has been used by other disciplines also for describing post-colonial studies. The term subaltern denotes that section of the colonial population who are socially, politically, and geographically deprived and excluded from the hierarchy of power in a colony under imperial control. The term was first coined by Antonio Gramsci to describe cultural hegemony within the society under which a specific section of the population and social groups are excluded and displaced from the socio-economic institutions of society so that their agencies and voices in colonial politics could be denied. The term subaltern and subaltern studies were used in post-colonial studies in India by the subaltern historians who explored the role of people belonging to the lower strata of the population in framing the history of India and re-explored the political role of the social and economic elites in the history of India. The formulation of the term subaltern used by the subaltern historian is not taken from British colonial rank of the term subaltern, because we find that in British colonial rank, the term subaltern has often been used to refer military officers who were subordinate. So we find that the usage of the term in subaltern history of India is not similar to the usage of the term by the British. Instead, the term subaltern is taken from, as I have already mentioned, that Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci's own use of the term. He had used the terms in his prison notebooks that referred solely to peasants who have not been integrated into Marx's conception of industrial capitalist system. Subaltern studies seeks to fill the gap in Indian historiography between people's history and the perceived history of India, between what has been archived in a narrative of power by the British Raj and what has been regarded as popular history. Noted historian Dipesh Chakraborty mentions that subaltern studies emerged out of anti-colonial thought rather than post-colonial. So here you see that Dipesh Chakraborty very clearly he pointed out that the term subaltern in India, in the context of India, emerged out of anti-colonial and not as a part of post-colonial. But at the same time, he pointed out, or he cited Gayatri Spivak's work and membership of the group as integrating post-colonial studies into the movement. Under subaltern studies, 10 volumes of works have come up till now. Many historians have contributed significantly to the series and addressed the subaltern issues from diverse perspectives. One of the leading historians, David Arnold, brought to light the story of a long series of disturbances and rebellions of hillmen in the Gudem and Rampa hill areas of Andhra Pradesh during 1839 to 1924. Arnold also wrote about Madras famine, where he discussed about peasant consciousness and actions in crisis for subsistence and survival. He complained that the voluminous literature on Indian famines till now or hitherto have not discussed the disaster in terms of human and peasant experiences, which have been subordinated to the descriptions of state policies and relief administration. Another subaltern historian, Gyan Pandey, gave an account of the peasant revolts of Awadh during 1912 to 1922 and its impact on Indian nationalism. Then Stephen Hanningham has shown how in Bihar and in eastern Uttar Pradesh, the Quit India movement of 1942 was a dual revolt consisting of an elite nationalist uprising combined with a subaltern upsurge that involved the enthusiasm and popularization of a broad section or broad spectrum of the Indian society. Arvind Das contested the attribution of agrarian changes in Bihar during 1947 to 1978 as elite-sponsored land reforms. To him, there were two agrarian changes from above through Zamindari abolition and Bhudan movement, both of which were not elite-sponsored but responses to peasant discontent. The first followed after years of agitation by Swami Shahajananda Saraswati and the powerful Kisan Sabha, while the second came up as a military communist-led peasant upsurge in Telangana. Arvind Das observed that both of these were measures to obstruct class war in the Bihar countryside. In a similar strain, we find that N.K. Chanda, in his Agricultural Workers in Bardhaman, revealed the awfully poor condition of the agricultural laborers and peasants in terms of wages, earnings, underdevelopment, and poverty in Bardhaman. Dipesh Chakravarti had studied the conditions of Calcutta jute mill workers between 1890 and 1940. In another work, he has also discussed about the jute mill workers during 1920 to 1950. Chakravarti has shown how the elitist attitude has crept into socialist and communist ranks, the leaders treating the unions as their own zamindari, and their contact with the workers degenerating into the hierarchical terms of Babu-Kuli relationship. So here you see that Chakravarti pointed out that how the leaders treated the unions as their own possession, as their own property, as their own zamindari, and how as a result of that, the relationship between the workers and the leaders came under certain hierarchical structure, hierarchical terms of Babu-Kuli relationship. Shahid Amin, in his essay on Gandhi, has discussed how Mahatma Gandhi got himself registered into the peasant consciousness. Shahid Amin, in his essay on Gandhi, has discussed how Mahatma Gandhi's charisma got itself registered with peasant consciousness. Amin believed that an important element of Gandhi's charisma was the peasants' belief Peasants believe in superstitions and miracles. David Hardiman's essay on the Devi reformist movement among the tribals of South Gujarat throws light into the tribal consciousness of the region. Hardiman felt that the discussion should attract the attention of the sociologists too. Sumit Sarkar, the noted historian Sumit Sarkar, made a comparison between anti-partisan agitation and non-cooperation Khilafat movements in India and informed that the anti-partition agitation in India did not go beyond the confines of the Hindu upper-class Bhadralok group. While in the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, there was popular initiative that eventually alarmed the leaders into calling for a halt. Ranajit Guha, in his Forestry and Social Protest in British Kumaun, shows that the Chipko Andolan movement, starting from 1973 in Kumaun against the commercial exploitation of forest, has in fact shown a history that began from the 90s of the 19th century and lasted till the 20s of the 20th century. Guha observed that the reservation of Kumaun forests in 1911 to 1917 met with violent and sustained opposition from the traditionally simple and law-abiding hillmen, culminating into the revolt of 1921. This resulted in paralyzing the administration within few months, first by a strike against statutory labor and then through a systematic campaign. Tanika Sarkar worked on Jitu Santal's movement in Malda in northwestern Bengal, where in 1924 an anti-landlord tenant agitation developed under Jitu Santal's leadership, which continued till 1932 when the leader was shot. Sarkar observed that the Bhadralok class was sympathetic to Jitu Santal's revolt. Tanika Sarkar has shown in her work that how the responsibility for the revolt was taken away from the tribal leader by assigning it comfortably to the Swarajist agitators from outside. Gautam Bhadra, in his Four Rebels of 1857, has discussed how the principal modes of historiography on the revolt of 1857 up till now have portrayed the event as an elitist venture. Bhadra observed that the ordinary rebel and his perception of alien rule and contemporary crisis have not been discussed in the historical literature on the Great Revolt of 1857 so far. He emphasized on four of such rebel characters of 1957, such as Shahamal, Devi Singh, Gonu, and Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah. So thus we find that the role of the lower classes of Indian societies have been shown from different perspectives by different historians in the Subaltern series, edited by Ranajit Guha. And we find that through these writings, those aspects of Indian societies which have not received adequate attention till now have received adequate attention under the auspicious of Subaltern Studies, edited by Ranajit Guha. Now let us speak about the features of Subaltern history writing, or we can say Subaltern historiography too. According to Ranajit Guha, Subaltern Studies intervened into the historical methods of thought that could not represent the history of nationalism in India without celebrating the role of the elites, and played an important role in bringing the larger nation into the discourse. So thus, Ranajit Guha, for the first time, he pointed out that subaltern studies actually played an important role in bringing up that part of Indian history which have not been represented in the history of nationalism in India. And we find that it celebrated the role of elites too, along with the roles or the contributions of the lower sections of the Indian societies. Thus, Guha pointed out that it gave a picture of Indian nation, because up till now, the histories which were written on India, those histories mostly spoke about the upper section of the society and paid little attention to the contributions of the people and the belonging to the lower strata of the society. And thus, Guha felt that the histories written so far have not taken the Indian nation as a whole. It was only with the coming of subaltern history writing that the entire Indian nation was brought within the purview of Indian history writing. Dipesh Chakraborty states that the declared aim of subaltern studies was to produce historical analysis in which the subaltern groups were viewed as subjects of history rather than its objects. So this Dipesh Chakraborty pointed out that with the coming of subaltern history writing in India, it was for the first time that those people who were considered as the objects of Indian history have become the subjects of Indian history. Now, the subaltern class, when the subaltern historians in India talk about or speak about subaltern class, it does not refer to a class which was homogeneous. We find that the subaltern class was not homogeneous, nor was it an object that history happened to, but a living group of people comprised of active participants in society. Guha, in his work titled Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India, has pluralized the discourses of power by refusing to combine capital and modernity in the existing histories associated with people. To him, capital and power are separate variables for understanding systems of subordination in colonial India. So, thus, we find that various genres of subaltern studies have emerged. Like we have papers on peasant movements in India nowadays. Now, this particular paper primarily focus on subaltern contribution, that is peasant contribution in Indian society, the rebellions, the revolts of this section of the population in the context of Indian history. Now, subjecthood is a large concern with the subaltern analysis of the colonial society, as Dipesh Chakraborty discusses how the initial configuration of the subject in subaltern studies worked from an understanding of subjecthood as driven by social history and political rebellion. Subaltern studies analyzes the binary relationship of the subaltern class and the ruling classes. It studies the interplay of domination, of dominance and subordination in colonial systems, most notably in India, though the methods of the movements have since been applied to other nations, spaces and historical moments. Subaltern studies aims to uncover the histories of the groups which have remained largely undocumented in the colonial and national archives. Here I would like to mention that those areas which were previously considered as within the domain of anthropological studies have been brought within the purview of historical studies in India by the subaltern historians. So, thus, we find that the subaltern history focuses to recover, examine, and privilege the agencies of the underclass within the networks of capitalism, colonialism, and nationalism. And subaltern studies thus seeks to fill the gap in historiography between people's history and perceived history writing in India. So thus you see that subaltern historians actually added a new dimension to history writing in India. As I have mentioned just now, that those areas which were previously considered as within the domain of anthropology have been included within the domain of history by the subaltern historians. The subaltern historians, by including all sections of the population within their discussion, although primarily emphasizing on the lower strata of the society, we find that the subaltern historians have spoken about Indian nation in a much more broader manner compared to the histories which were studied or written up till now. Another critical tenet of subaltern studies was the rejection of the teleological understanding of progress, often adapted by European historians who considered the history of below, within inverted comma, history of below movement writings on India as pre-political, feudal, and pre-modern. So we find that in the British history writing, we find that the British historians have considered the movements of these lower sections of the people in Indian society as pre-political. They have considered these movements as feudal in character and pre-modern in character. So we find that the subaltern historians, they reject this kind of interpretations of the movements of people from the lower section of Indian society. Ranajit Guha and other subaltern historians rejected such evolutionary formulations of political consciousness and instead argued that people are contemporaneous with colonialism and had equal and important participation in the political realm. So these particular notions that the movements of the lower sections of the population, Indian population, were feudal in character, were pre-modern in character, these were rejected by historians like Ranajit Guha and other subaltern historians who said that, who observed that these movements were equally contemporary in character rather than pre-modern or feudal. Subaltern studies seeks to discover the discourses of dissent and resistance arising from everyday political actions of ordinary people. And we find that these studies trace the systems of silencing and oppression. So this tracing the systems of silencing and oppression is another key aspect of subaltern studies intervention. Dipesh Chakraborty, in retrospect, saw that the two main sub-themes of subaltern studies are the archaic in the modern and the subjects of history. Now, despite these features or merits of subaltern history, we find that subaltern history or history writing in India have been criticized from different dimensions. Thus, though the original subaltern studies group emerged out of historical and cultural studies, but the concept is used by other disciplines also to interpret any population that is de-enfranchised and unreachable due to hegemonic oppression, and hence subaltern studies are found to overlap with post-colonial studies having similar aims and prospects. Gayatri Spivak intervened in post-colonial literary studies with her seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And alongside, Rosalind O'Hanlon critiqued the subaltern studies for not considering gender in questions of subalternity. Spivak, in her book, A Critic of Post-Colonial Reason, worked on the Rani of Sirmur in colonial history and observed that even women considered as elite are rarely traceable in the colonial narratives. The subaltern historians have also been criticized for interpreting class as oversimplified dichotomies. We find that dichotomies are such that subaltern studies has no greater theme than popular militancy and consciousness. And we find that the subaltern historians have been criticized for such kind of dichotomy as loose and as a loose kind of interpretation. And based on a loose negative elite subaltern dichotomy, subaltern studies has no greater theme than popular militancy and consciousness. This is a very, very important criticism we find that have been which the subaltern historians have faced. It is often considered as a category of sub-history or local narratives, supplementing and enriching mainstream historical accounts and filling up the lacuna in them. It is also held that a continuous and sustained narratives is outside its purview. That is, subaltern history, as I have already mentioned, is considered as a sub-history or a local narrative, and therefore a continued and sustained narrative is outside its purview. So these are the criticisms which the subaltern historians have faced and subaltern history have faced. But despite the criticisms, we have to acknowledge that subaltern history has been successful in bringing out innumerable records that stood witness to several stories and struggles of ordinary people. It could bring forth new questions for historical examinations on topics associated with history from below, which were long considered as unsettled. Subaltern history has given respect and restored individual human beings and groups hitherto considered as too low for elite historical treatment. Such contributions, if brought together and woven in mainstream history, would significantly enrich the existing arena of historical studies in India. So with this, I come to an end to my discussion. Thank you.